As Baam progresses through the tower, he continues to accumulate more and more different powers. So much so that some people are a little confused as to what powers Baam currently possesses. So I'm going to start from the beginning to give you an accurate summary of what powers Baam has, how he got them, and also all the mysteries that surround them. Oh, and as I write this video, I'm at chapter 525, so the video will spoil pretty much until that chapter. Anyway, hi, it's Lilian, and today we're going for a factual analysis of Baam's powers. It is structurally complicated to explain Baam's powers because they are all interconnected, they influence each other, so it gets messy when we try to explain it all. That's why I'm going to tell you first the powers that Baam acquired chronologically, then we'll make a synthesis at the end to have a clearer global vision of all these powers and of what links them together. To start with the most obvious one, Baam is an irregular and therefore the laws of the tower do not apply to him. He doesn't need to contract with an administrator to manipulate the Shinsu, for example. He can also grab a sword from a member of the Ari family, as we saw recently, and his actions can't be predicted by a guide, since he comes from outside the tower and will break his determinism, as I explained in the video about the guides. Being an irregular isn't really a power in itself, but it does give you more freedom. And irregulars are also known to be extremely powerful, so I wanted to mention that anyway. We can also note the fact that Baam is extremely good at manipulating the Shinsu, and he is actually blessed by the Shinsu. This is something I explained in the lore video about the Shinsu, with the positive tendencies and all that, so I'll refer you to that he is able to copy the mechanics of pretty much any attack he takes, and he also seems to be able to break any spell. Although it's not clear if this is all due to the fact that he's an irregular. Anyway, all this is what Baam already had when he entered the tower. There's more, but we'll talk about that later. In Season 1, Baam will simply learn to master the Shinsu, so there is not much to say about that. On the other hand, a lot of things will happen during the 5-year ellipsis that will take place between Season 1 and 2. First of all, the most obvious, he will train with Ha-Jin-sung, who will teach him a lot of techniques related to Shinsu and make him progress quickly, but that's not all. He will also transform Baam into a living ignition weapon. I refer you to my lore video on the workshop for more details, or simply to reread chapters 42 and 43 of Season 2, which explain everything very clearly. But to make it simple, an ignition weapon like the Black March, for example, is a weapon in which a soul has been breathed in and refined with Shinsu. For a living ignition weapon, it is exactly the same thing, except that instead of breathing the soul into a weapon, it is breathed into a living being. And note that the souls used in the creation of living ignition weapons all seem to be called devils by the researchers at the workshop. Anyway, back to Baam. In chapter 43 of Season 2, Baam explains to Horyang how it happened. Ha-Jin-sung told Baam that he was going to show him how to become a god, and then said that he was only giving him a small part of the power to become one, before plunging him into the wine glass on the 2nd floor. I already talked about it in the lore video about the floors in the tower, but the wine glass is a kind of underground lake filled with a very special liquid. It is thanks to this liquid that Baam was able to launch such a powerful strike against the bull towards the end of the test, because this liquid optimizes the power of a Shinsu user, among others. And in this liquid was a red light that will be in Baam's body. We will have the first manifestation of this thing at the beginning of Season 2, with what SIU called the lobster, in the endnote of chapter 42. It is a kind of exoskeleton that will appear to heal Baam's wounds. By the way, at this point Horyang will already suspect that Baam is a living ignition weapon. Anyway, the point is that the red light that Baam saw in the wine glass is the devil that will turn him into a living ignition weapon. By the way, note also that much later, when Baam fights Akryung in Season 3, he will see him regenerating and will make the following remark. He regenerates just like the devil inside me. But I'm not going to talk about Akryung because damn, this character is too weird. There are too many mysterious things surrounding him. I swear he gets on my nerves. Then after Baam was forced to join the Fug team led by Reflejo, they will give him a false thorn. This false thorn is implanted in him in order to prepare him for the power of the real thorn. Besides, we will see him using it during the game. One shot, one opportunity. We will learn towards the end of the arc of the workshop battle that it was also a bowl, a kind of receptacle, which will contain the real thorn inside Baam. This thorn is the first fragment of which Baam will recover at the end of this arc. Before talking about the thorn, I'll just remind you that Baam will also train during the small ellipse between the end of the Battle of the Workshop and the beginning of the Hell Train saga, by going to many martial arts schools in order to copy all their techniques. It's quite anecdotal, but there you go. Anyway, let's talk about the thorn. First of all, the thorn is a thing that Enryu left behind after killing the administrator of the 43rd floor, which would allow to kill Jihad, and which was divided into 4 fragments. I already talked about it in detail at the very end of the lore video about weapons and items, so I'll send you back there if you want a more synthetic explanation. But anyway, Baam will get the first fragment at the end of the workshop battle, and will learn to use it little by little, even if at the beginning he couldn't use it very long, and it had a heavy impact on his body. The power of the thorn is quite vague, but obviously this first fragment of the thorn will have the effect of boosting Baam's physical power at the same time as his manipulation of the Shinsu. It should also be noted that the power of the thorn strengthens the power of Hokni's eyes. Knowing that the power of his eyes also comes from Enryu, the connection between the two seems quite logical. Next, there is one thing I said in the weapons and items video about the thorn that I'd like to correct because it was inaccurate. On the floor of death, Heljo will use the power of the red Tricia, which is a piece of the 43rd floor administrator's body for reminder, to create the zero zone, a technique that decreases the concentration of Shinsu from a whole area. This technique was done thanks to the power of total control over the Shinsu that the administrators have, a power that is even superior to normal irregulars like Urek, since he could not use the Shinsu at that time. However, this was not the case for Enryu during his fight against the administrator, where he was able to manipulate the Shinsu as he wished, and thus was able to kill the administrator. The thorn is something that Enryu left behind, so I made the direct connection. The thorn holds a power similar to Enryu's, a power greater than that of the administrators, so, like Enryu, Baam can manipulate the Shinsu despite Red Tricia's control over the Shinsu, thanks to the thorn. But it's actually more complex than that, and to understand it better, we'll have to talk about another thing that will appear in Baam at the same time as he masters the thorn, the devil that the Fug injected inside Baam in the wine glass. And for that we'll have to go back to the workshop battle. In chapter 84 of season 2, Beta will give us some explanation about the thorn. He said then that the thorn was like an ignition weapon that was dead, an empty shell, that it was devoid of a soul in fact, and therefore unusable. So the Fug made a deal with the scientists at the workshop to find a way to ignite it. Then one day, the workshop will find, we don't know how, the devil able to ignite the thorn. This devil will be stored in the wine glass, unless that's where it was found, we don't know, and that's when the workshop will start researching living ignition weapons in order to find a method to put this devil inside Baam. That's what actually triggered the experiments on Horyung and Kasano, which will be sort of half of the living ignition weapon. And it was after the experiments on Horyung and Kasano were completed that the Fug was able to transform Baam into a living ignition weapon. Then, the data collected on Baam's transformation will be used to create a complete living ignition weapon from an ordinary human, and it is for this purpose that the beta experiments will take place. As for Emily, well, the experiments she underwent came from the fact that part of the Fug wanted to melt Baam with the thorn in order to be able to use the powers of the thorn as they saw fit, so she was a person who was transformed into a living ignition weapon before being dissolved. Anyway, that was just to remind you of the whole plot since it's a bit complicated to follow, but that's where it gets really interesting. During Beta's explanation, he will tell Baam that the devil was a being that competed with a god. The truth is that the devils that create living ignition weapons are fragments of an administrator, and there is ample evidence for this. The first is the description of the devil that will be implanted in the bodies of Horyung and Kasano. In the English translation, which I think is better, Kasano described it as something that was constantly changing, as if it refused to have a form of its own. And this is very reminiscent of the administrator of the 43rd floor, who was constantly changing form while fighting Enryu. Then there is Beta, who in chapter 254 of season 2 will not be affected by the fact that Red Tricia sucks up all of Shinsu, because just like him, he has a tiny bit of the power of an administrator in him. So Kun is right in thinking that it is because he is a living ignition weapon, but the basic reason is that all living ignition weapons have the power of an administrator in them. And finally, the most obvious proof is with Baam, when the Red Tricia sees the devil inside Baam and screams at him why he had the power of an administrator inside him, making it clear that it was not the thorn that allowed him to have a power similar to an administrator, but it is still through the thorn that Baam controls the devil and his powers, since it is this devil that ignites the thorn, which is somehow contained within. SIU showed all this again indirectly by putting foreshadowing everywhere. He's way too good, but we're used to it now. Anyway, it is thanks to the thorn that this devil, this fragment of the administrator, will appear little by little in Baam's consciousness. First of all, the first time that Baam really uses the thorn to its full potential during his outburst at train station, he will say in his thoughts, "Someone is talking to me and telling me that this force is still only a part of what it can be." Then that same voice will speak to him as he fights his way through the tests to get to the 36th and 37th floors and will even take control of his body. Then he will finally appear a little later in the form of a red ball, saying well that the researchers of the workshop called him Devil, which immediately makes the connection with what I said earlier. We will then begin one of the most important passages in the evolution of Baam, the Revolution. This is the name given by the god of the Guardians of the Hell Train to a special training that he reserves for the irregulars, and that Jihad and his companions went through during their ascent of the tower, this training being in truth the true purpose of the Hell Train, for I recall that it was built specifically to train Jihad and his companions during their ascent. During this training, where he will be led to find his true self in the rice pot. Baam will actually find the devil in his physical form. During this passage, the devil tells Baam that he offers him his power in order to surpass all others and become king, which Baam will refuse, judging this strength as false and useless while, according to the god of the guardians, Jahad had agreed to acquire strength for this purpose. Then comes the Dala show, in which Baam will have to fight Bulsar Elliot, one of the 3 mad dogs of Yama, and in this fight we will have a flashback that will show us how the training in the rice pot ended. Baam will tell the devil that he will fight with his own strength, which is symbolized by a sun, and which will try to consume the devil to make him disappear. Then comes the conclusion of the arc with the fight against Hoquin, during which the last clone of Hoquin, which is in fact a mixture of his sister, Albida, and the billion souls of the people that White had genocided, will give all the strength of these souls to Baam, which will give him a power up to defeat Haokin. However, this clone of Hoquin notices that it is very strange that he could absorb so much strength so easily without any backlash. But where it gets really interesting is when we get to the second training with the God of Guardians. Remember, at the very beginning of the video, when I was listing all the powers, or rather all the specificities of Baam, I told you that I had voluntarily omitted something, and this thing, it is what we will call, to make it simple, the sun. This sun, the one we saw at the end of the first training of Baam's revolution, and which tried to eat the Blue Devil, will reappear in the second training with the Blue Devil, who will say that he managed to escape thanks to the billions of souls that went inside Baam and that this sun simply devoured, hence the ease with which Baam endured these billions of souls. This sun, this power, will be described by the Blue Devil as a power that devours everything, that absorbs the power of others to make it its own, and it is very much implied that this power is Baam's true power, a power he has always possessed. And although we know almost nothing about it, it echoes a lot of things, like for example the fact that he can copy all the attacks he undergoes, that he just absorbs more and more stuff as he ascends, but also and especially to this famous sentence that Rachel will drop to Baam at the end of the arc of the Hidden Floor. "You're not here to save the tower, you're a monster born to curse it and devour everything. Arlen always said you were a monster." He will actually use this power for a very short time against Bulsar Elliot and will one-shot him with it. We don't get to see much of the scene since it's a bit off-screen, but everyone is surprised, and even Evan, who is a guide anyway, wonders what this power could be. On the other hand, and this is important for the continuation, when the devil inside Baam says that he devoured all the souls, it is an exaggeration. Baam has simply absorbed them. They are inside him but are still alive in a way. He has not consumed them. It is also worth noting that he used some of the power of white souls against Kaiser in the Name Hunt arc. We can see it through the kind of white particles that surrounded him at that time. But again, he wasn't consuming those souls, he was just borrowing their power. There will also be a passage on the floor of death that will remind us that he has all these souls inside him. Then comes the third training with the God of Guardians, between the Name Hunt station and the Death Floor, where this time Baam will learn a special technique that only irregulars can master, the Shinsu Black Hole Sphere, or Shinwonryu in Korean, for which the correct translation is Divine Source. The only exceptions are the God of Guardians, who can only use it on the train, and Akryung. Yes, him again. It is a technique which allows to make simple, to compress all the Shinsu of a space in only one point and to make it explode, a little like a star which collapses on itself to make a supernova. A technique he will learn by taking it in the face for a change. Note also that this technique also allows to absorb the Shinsu of an attack of his opponent. After that, he will get 2 things from the Floor of Death. First of all, he will absorb the Red Tricia, a piece of the administrator's body, just like the Blue Devil he had inside him. Since they are 2 similar entities, we will tend to call them Blue Devil and Red Devil, or Blue Tricia and Red Tricia, but anyway. Then he will get the second fragment of the thorn after having promised Gustang to get Jahad's bracelet on the Hidden Floor. By the way, I quickly remind you that it is thanks to the absorption of the Red Tricia that Baam was able to get the second thorn fragment, since a thorn fragment without a devil to ignite it is like an empty shell. And now you're probably thinking that it's quite a stroke of luck that Baam absorbed this devil at the right time, that it's a bit easy, but there are many things that indicate that it wasn't a coincidence, so we'll dwell on that a bit. I'm not going to go into too much theory since this is an analysis, but I'm going to put forward a few points to consider. First of all, remember, Fug and a group of researchers at the workshop have joined forces to research the thorn, devils, living ignition weapons, all of that. Then, I'll just remind you of a little sentence from Kun Hachuling, who, after the battle of the workshop, in the epilogue, will tell us that Uruk has messed up on an upper floor and is therefore rather busy. Then on the Floor of Death, we will learn that Uruk, while trying to find a link between the Fug and the workshop, found a special liquid in a secret base of the Fug and the workshop, allowing to separate the Red Tricia from Heljo's body. To me, it seems obvious that the Fug, or at least a faction of it, had the objective of separating the Red Tricia from Hell Joe precisely to give it to Baam before giving him the second fragment of the Thorn, but that's not all. Remember that it was Gustang who gave the first fragment of the Thorn to the Fug, that it was Gustang who secretly directed the whole battle of the workshop, that it was Gustang who gave the second fragment of the Thorn to Baam, and finally that he was saying, while talking to someone without knowing who, that despite Urek being an important variable, his plan was going on as planned. Besides, it seems that the person he is talking to is also very connected to Rachel. But anyway, all this to say that everything was planned by Gustang from the beginning, and that the drug allowing to separate Hell Joe from the Red Tricia probably also had as a function to transform the Red Tricia in order to make it absorbable by Baam. After all, the researchers of the workshop are quite knowledgeable on this subject with all their experiments. Besides, it is perhaps also the existence of Hell Joe, a person who was able to absorb, even in an imperfect way, a part of the administrator's body, that gave the workshop the idea to create living ignition weapons. There would be a lot to say if we were to start theorizing about the workshop, or about everything surrounding Gustang's grand plan, who his allies are, etc. But I'll save that for later, and then we're here to talk about Baam's powers. So we're going to move on to the hidden floor, and there's going to be a lot to talk about. First of all, there is the training with Kun Edan's data, which will have for objective to improve his manipulation of the Shinsu by finding his form of predilection as well as his property. But note that during this training, Baam will only find his form, which will be the orb. His property will remain neutral. However, he will make a lot of subtle variations with this orb. The first one is going to take place during his fight against Kiseya's data and Rak's sworn enemy, when he is going to mix the orb with the power of the Thorn, developing a very great power. But above all, it seems that it has a particular power, the one to control the space. This is at least what Baam seems to say, even if the concept remains a bit vague. But in any case, it's in line with the logic of the powers of the Thorn, which allow to use the power of the devils of these pieces of administrator. And it's even literally shown in chapter 295 of season 2, with this image of Baam controlling the orb with what looks a bit like a fusion of the two devils he has inside him that encompasses him, showing that it's their power he's using. One last interesting point, when Baam's orb is going to absorb his sworn enemy, we will see the Thorn igniting just before, showing that it is thanks to it that he manages to do so. By the way, this absorption doesn't count as yet another power of Baam because it's not going to give him a power up or anything, it's going to be more of a metaphorical absorption. And anyway, it's just data from the hidden floor, it's not something tangible. Anyway, after that, Kunedan will continue the revolution that Baam started with the God of Guardians by creating a similar environment to the rice pot. And we can see the consequences of his training in the fight against the data of Jahad. The first is that he will succeed in placing the Shinwonryu in the orb, thus multiplying its power. The second is something more fundamental, it is the famous line that we will see regularly after that. A line meaning that Baam is himself, a line symbolizing a power that is his own. And it is once this line is drawn, once Baam releases this real power that is in him, that his Shinsu will change and become black. It is once this line is drawn that he will fight in his own way. And it is from there that the name of his techniques will be called Baam style. And it is also from that moment that the horns of the red and blue demons will appear on his head. In fact, at this moment, it seems that Baam has really made the synthesis of all the powers that are in him. It is also very likely that this black Shinsu is the property of Baam's Shinsu. As for what property it is exactly, it is more complicated because nothing is very clear. But it seems in any case that this real power of Baam is to devour everything, just as the sun that was in him devoured the souls of white. We see it when he uses his orb mixed with the Shinwonryu, to which he adds this black Shinsu against Jahad's data, when the latter will take out a kind of leviathan from his sword, Lycalicus. Baam's attack will simply swallow this leviathan. Jahad himself will say that it is as if he had devoured everything, and that only he remained. It is also in this fight that Baam will learn to create wings with his Shinsu. He also seems to activate completely the first fragment of Thorn. I'm not quite sure if the activation is really complete, but the fact is that at this point, Jahad says that his power is similar to that of an administrator, and this is the first time we saw the Thorn pierce Baam's body like that. Jahad also talks about a control of space, as we have already seen several times. He will manage to tear off Jahad's arm, which goes against the laws of the hidden floor, and after that the fight is going to go in all directions. It is going to blow up everywhere. Anyway, go and read again the fight between Baam and the data of Jahad. It is really incredible. Then we will have a last thing that will happen during the arc of the hidden floor, at the very end. It's when Baam will almost be killed by the fragment of the power of the real Jahad. Indeed, while being unconscious, Baam will activate for the first time the second fragment of the Thorn, which will create a door to exit the hidden floor. Another space control technique, as the real Jahad will analyze it, specifying that it is a skill that rivals that of a god. Anyway, let's go a little further with the last station arc. In this arc, Yuri will lend his Black March to Baam, who will activate it and fight with it. But later in the fight, he will try to do the same thing as when he activated the thorn completely, and will therefore pierce his body with the activated thorn, in order to make the power of the Black March his own. At that moment, the famous line will appear indicating that he is using his real power, a line that will be surrounded by black indicating that the Black March covers this power. Externally we will see this effect thanks to his horns that will become black. Moreover, at the end, Baam will completely activate the first fragment of the thorn and even partially the second fragment for a very short time. We will even see the line again, but as if all these powers were overflowing, becoming uncontrollable, as if they were completely beyond Baam's skills. So he won't be able to master all this well enough to be of any use against Calavan, but he will still manage to aggravate the wound that Hajinsong had inflicted on him. That's about it for Season 2. We can see how useful the whole saga of the Hell Train was in Baam's evolution, but all this will continue in Season 3 with, first of all, an ellipse during which Baam will be trained by Evankul, training which will simply consist in fighting in increasingly difficult battlefields of the tower without being allowed to use the Thorn and the Black March. With each completed battlefield, Evankel will give him a lesson on the orb so that he can master it better. Also note that Baam will train with Hachai, an A-ranked regular who refused to become a ranker. He will also learn to use a technique taught to him by Yuhansong, a technique that consists in using the fact that he is blessed by Shinsu and therefore has a positive tendency that, to put it simply, the power of Baam's bangs does not decrease when he increases the number of bangs he manipulates in order to create a ring of Shinsu in which Baam will be able to accumulate Shinsu. Then we will head towards the end of the cage arc, when Baam will create a sword from the red Tricia, which will resemble the metamorphosis of the dogs of the Yama clan. We will see the famous line drawn at that moment. There is not much to say about this, except that Baam has managed to use the power of the demons without using the thorn. When he activates the thorn, he will go to level 2 of the transformation, making the sword bigger and more powerful. Then he will do the same thing in the Nest arc with the blue Tricia by creating a shield when he faces Calavan. And finally we come to the last fight that took place, and where Baam has acquired a new power. At the time I write this video, it is his fight against White. The fight will go normally at first, then White will reveal to Baam that he had eaten Prince and a crap that Baam will go crazy, and just before Arya drags him by force to the teleporter to escape, we will see a black orb. When Baam is on the other side, we will see the sun, his true power, awaken, as well as the line that represents it, around which we will see cracks. Proof that Baam's mental state is unstable and that his power is ready to overflow. Then, the fight will start again when White will arrive to him. A fight during which Baam will really want to kill his opponent, but he's going to get smashed, like really. And on the verge of death, he's going to do something amazing that we don't have a clear explanation for. He's going to reverse the entropy. Those who have seen Tenet know what I'm talking about, but basically, reversing entropy is, to put it very simply, going back in time, reversing the course of things, but only for a part of reality like an object or a body for instance, like not for the whole universe. That's why White normally attends the scene. Well, it's very simplified as an explanation, but we're going to avoid going into complicated stuff. He will not really resurrect Arya, but rather return her body to its previous state, before she was decapitated. White will also explain, from his point of view, that it was probably because of Arya's law-bending abilities that she was able to delay the moment her soul left her body for good, and was able to resurrect, rather than just be a sewn-up corpse. As for the explanation of how Baam was able to reverse the entropy, well, we don't know. There are several possibilities between his real power, with the sun and all, the power of the thorn that allows him to control space, or the power of Arya that he could have used. There is enough to theorize. But I'm not going to get into that because, as I said, I'm trying to stay as factual as possible. After that, we will see the power of the thorn completely overflowing and mixing with Baam's Black Shinsu. Black Shinsu, which is his property since his fight against Jihad's data for reminder. And we will have new clues on the nature of this property, because indeed White will tell us that in contact with this Shinsu, his sword erodes. A bit like if this Shinsu came to nibble his power. Then he will create a gigantic black orb impregnated with this property. And this is where we will see something interesting. We will go back inside him and see the two demons, and the billions of souls that Albida gave him at the Dala show. Except that these souls will be running away from the famous sun, the real power of Baam, which will be this time completely devouring them, consuming them. Baam will also rain this black Shinsu on the whole field, which reminds strongly the passage of Enryu to the death floor, and the fight will continue in a deluge of Shinsu. In the end, White will manage to reach Baam in hand-to-hand combat, but this one will gather almost all the powers which are in him in his hands, in order to hold White's sword, where all his power was concentrated in order to absorb it. He will then completely consume the billions of souls that were inside him while activating the two thorns. White will finally lose and drop his sword, and lose all the power of the souls he had accumulated since he got off the Hell train in the last station arc. This power will spread and be absorbed by Baam, Kun, and Rak. Note also that during this fight, even if Baam says he has gathered all his power, he was not yet completely at full strength. Indeed, he hadn't completely activated the thorns by piercing his body with it, as he had done at the last station with the first fragment, and he still hasn't used the Black March either. Anyway, that's where we are now. But as I know that it's a lot to digest and that presenting things in a chronological way can be a bit messy, I'll give you a summary of all his powers. So to summarize, Baam is an irregular, which puts him above the others in a general way. It gives him a huge potential. He is able to break any spell visibly. He is extremely gifted in the manipulation of Shinsu, and he is also able to copy the mechanism of the techniques he undergoes. He has two entities inside his body, which are called demon or Tricia, whatever, and which are in fact body parts of an administrator, which makes him a living activation weapon. These two administrator fragments allow him to activate the two thorn fragments he possesses. The power of these thorn fragments is not yet well defined, but it seems that they allow, beyond the simple power boost, to use a power similar to that of an administrator, such as the free manipulation of the Shinsu, and consequently the control of space. In addition, there is the billion souls that White sacrificed before he was trapped in the train, which Baam has recently consumed completely, as well as the 1/3 of the souls that White has absorbed and consumed since he left the train, the latter being shared between Rak, Kun, and Baam after his fight against White in the nest. And finally, there is the power of the Black March that Baam absorbed during the battle of the last station at the end of Season 2. In addition to all this, there are the powers that Baam has acquired through training. I think of all the hand-to-hand techniques, even if it is quite anecdotal, or the various Shinsu techniques that he has developed. But the most interesting part remains the acquisition of the property of his Shinsu as well as its form. The form of Baam's Shinsu is the orb, and its property is this kind of black Shinsu which seems to erode and even devour everything it finds. And finally, there is the Divine Source technique, Shinwonryu in Korean, which allows to compress all the surrounding Shinsu in one point to make it explode. All this will often be mixed to increase the power of the attacks. For example, the Shinwonryu in the orb, or mixed with the power of the thorn, which allows a greater control of space. There are also partial metamorphoses using the powers of the two demons inside Baam to make a sword and a shield. And finally, the sun and the line, both of which represent Baam's true power. A power whose nature seems to be able to devour everything, which is therefore linked to many powers that Baam possesses, as we saw recently when he consumed all the souls that were inside him. The origin of this power is unknown. It doesn't seem to be linked to Baam's nature as an irregular, but it seems to be an innate power since it seems to have always been there, and is probably linked to Baam's nature, to the reason why he was locked up in that cave, and to the famous sentence that Rachel said to Baam during their last meeting, "You are a monster born to curse the tower and to devour everything." That's it for this analysis of Baam's powers. I hope it was clear enough and that it helped you understand this whole mess. It was more of an explanation video than an analysis, a bit like a lore video actually, but I really wanted to do it. Not only because I know that a lot of people were a bit confused, but also because I plan to do another video on Baam, which will be a real narrative analysis, and which will have to be based on the evolution of Baam's powers, on his physical evolution in fact. Because Baam's physical evolution is closely linked to his mental evolution. The evolution of his powers and the evolution of his mind are interdependent. Both evolve in parallel. And so I think that understanding Baam's powers, and especially the order in which he acquired them, will allow you to better understand certain passages in this next video and even to better understand the character yourself. And finally, I think it's quite obvious that many aspects of his powers also have a major impact on the main plot, whether it's the devils, the thorns, and of course the famous sun, for which I'll probably reserve a third video, which will be a little theory video this time. So I will have done the explanation, the analysis, and the theory about Baam, so we can say that I will have treated him well. Anyway, don't hesitate to like, comment, share, subscribe, all that, and we'll meet again for the next video.